So lecture one then, session one, globalisation, trade, economy, culture and paradox. Quite an extensive array of topics to talk about there. I hope you're not rushing off. I reckon that there's it's probably about, I don't know, there's about 50 odd slides in this. I reckon it'll probably take me about 3 hours to do this. So if you've not got anything else better to do, you can stick around. Oh, the look on your faces. No, it won't. It will probably take about, I don't know, I'll talk for about 40 minutes. We'll take a break and then we'll see where we are at the end of that. Okay. So what I want to do in terms of putting the outcome, informing you about what I want you to take away from this, which follows on again from the stuff that was taught that I released earlier on this morning. I want to talk about a bit more about capitalism, just review it really, but then we want to try and extend our understanding of the business systems, contemporary business systems, which I built upon this morning by trying to relate business systems and sort of like ideology as well that was in there, alongside our perspectives and views on economy as well. You know, I mean, this is not an economics subject, but we do touch upon economics or things related to the economy, you know, and so there is always that kind of overlap. But the bits that I want you to get out of it is more about how you think about things and how certain perspectives contradict or challenge challenge our accepted knowledges and what we should do in the event of those challenges. So we'll follow on along that route as well. Then I'm going to focus upon globalization, not too much because you'll have done it to death, is my guess. Is that, you know, I know this in years gone past, I've asked people questions to write essays about globalization, and by and large they've been bloody awful, because people have come with, again, with assumptions about what constitutes globalization, which they've picked up from their A-level studies, and they talk to me about containerization and air travel and stuff like that. It's not the question that I asked them. So really, I want to add a bit more texture to this notion about globalization and think about competing perspectives of globalization, of which there are three broad ones. There are people have written books and books and books about globalization, and all of it seems to contradict each other, and it's an odd kind of topic. But there are three basic perspectives on globalization: the hyper-globalist, the skeptic, and the transformationist, and I'll cover those. You can have a bet amongst yourselves to see which one is the perspective that I tend to favor. See how it goes. And then what I'll do is that I'm going to draw a link between economy and the perspectives on globalization to introduce to you what's known as a cultural economy view of business. Okay, so this is predicated upon looking at cultural perspective of organization, cultural perspective of economies, of work and business. So you know full well that an organization might have a culture. You would be well aware that a country itself might have a culture, but the cultural perspective suggests that all of those things are interlinked, which means that you get cultural derivations of economy. But further than that is that you can see the economy as being a cultural manifestation of what goes on in that particular country. To the extent that we can argue that the economy is a cultural thing, it's not a thing, it's not an object that's out there that can be measured and can be seen and so on and so forth. So when I say new vistas, that's kind of like posh language for saying a different way or an alternative way for thinking about the economy or business systems, which means that what we can do when is that how would we go about understanding the notion of which view of economy is more pertinent, which one is the right one. This is the same as I asked in the online lecture materials, is that how do you make a judge between socialism and capitalism? Which one would be the preferable system? Well, It's based upon the evidence and experiences that we have, which comes back to this whole notion of empirical observation. You know, less about theoretical consistency and more about what's happening in the real world, and let's have a look at the real world and make judgments on the back of that. Okay, so I'm going to introduce, or start to introduce, this idea of cultural economy, and I'm going to develop it more next time when we start to talk about finance, financial innovations, and halos, interestingly. Okay, so yeah, let's go to capitalism then first. Is that there's another definition. It's not the same as the one that I gave you in the materials, but capitalism is often defined as an economic system. Okay, and that system, I think, can from time to time slip into the notion of ideational or ideology, as you've seen from the debates between Schiff and Wolf. But at the nub of capitalism is that private actors are allowed to own and control the use of property in accord with their own interests. Axioms of economics would suggest that that is the only thing that can happen in an economy, where the invisible hand, Adam Smith's invisible hand, of the pricing mechanism coordinates supply and demand in markets in a way that is deemed to be in the best interests of society, i.e. it tends towards equilibrium and it is efficient. But the other side of that is that there is a limited role of government in this perspective. And the government's role is to provide peace, stability, justice, and tolerable levels of taxation. Okay, now there is a view on capitalism. It's not the view on capitalism. There are others, because as we've learned as well is that there are different framings of capitalism. Is that countries experience capitalism in different ways, and there are kind of like two broad parameters, or there's two ends of a continuum. I mean, thinking about capitalism in and of itself, at one end you have the liberal market economy, which would be typical of the UK and the US and Australia, but there are huge differences between the UK, the US and Australia, but they would be typically liberal market economies. And then you've got at the other end of it, a coordinated market economy, of which the sort of like at the very, very far end of that, you'd see China. But then I think that you could make an argument as to say that somewhere like Germany and also France are coordinated in that the state occupies a significant position within that capitalist society. Singapore is another extraordinarily good example of a coordinated market economy, although Singapore does its level best to try and convince everybody that it is a liberal market. Don't be fooled by the rhetoric, it certainly isn't. And some would regard deviations of either side of this to be exactly what they are, a deviation away from best practice. But as more nations become more liberal, become more capitalist, then all of those deviations and differences will disappear as a consequence of technology, and also, you know, will follow the leader, the technological leaders, or the historical, the organizational leaders. And to an extent that has happened whereby a lot of the West has followed a lot of the American perspectives on business and economy. In post-Second World War is that a lot of the largest firms of the world were American, and that was seen to be best practice, deemed to be best practice. And as a consequence is that other countries of the world tried to copy American organizations in terms of their cultures and so on and so forth. And as a consequence of that, a lot of the theory that we get out of business, or that you will study on this course, is American, you know. And it's good reason for that too, is that the American economy is the largest economy on the planet by some considerable margin, and therefore it assumes this kind of like nature of being the #1 economy, which has the #1 businesses and so on and so on and so forth. I think perhaps Mr. Trump has shattered that illusion to an extent, but we can discuss that as we go through the through the course and the materials. But nevertheless, there still exists this idea about this convergences of type, and that we will adopt the most successful or the best one, which does assume that there is a best one, which I find quite odd, actually. And then others see the economies or the type of capitalism that you have as just a bringing together, a natural bringing together of historical choices about the kind of society that you want to live in. And this, again, I think is exemplary of the kind of like arguments of determinism and shaping and so on and so forth, isn't it? In that, and where everybody converges towards the best type indicates that that is deterministic, that there is a best type, and that's inevitable that that will happen. And yet there is an alternative framing, which is more about, well, let's make a decision about what kind of economy we'd like to live in, and then see whether or not we can organize that one. There is a tension between the two, and these tensions exist all the way through what we're talking about. Let's look at quickly the international dimension of business, because I'm well aware that you will cover economics on your course that you're doing with us, and I don't want to cover this because you're gonna probably hear it again somewhere else anyway. So this is just a quick recap and I'm going over knowledge that you've probably already got here. I'm not going to tell you anything new, but I think it's important that we just need to touch upon it here, because I think it gives us a nice link into globalization, because, you know, what is globalization if it's not talking about the international dimensions of whatever it is that we're talking about? So there are, broadly speaking, two different theories or perspectives that relate to international trade. The classical one, which is based around the country, deals with imports and exports and comparative and absolute advantage. If you tie that back into the idea about markets and economies and moving towards best practice, it's worth pointing out that the World Bank and the IMF have determined the best kind of policy for developing economies, which is to focus upon goods that you have got a comparative advantage in, borrow money and trade. If we look at, say, some parts of the developing world, like, I don't know, let's think about Africa or Southern America, then we would perhaps cast a bit of a critical eye over that particular policy and to say, doesn't seem to be working particularly well, does it, if you're in one of those countries? Sure that there are success stories that are out there in terms of China, absolutely, South Korea, Japan, going back a little bit more, but Taiwan, Singapore, where those economies have not engaged in those particular that particular structure, that sort of Washington consensus idea, in that those economies have been very much centrally organized and very much they protected their own advantages and resisted international aid, and have financed it via their own banking system, which is different to the way that the IMF have kind of like suggested that it should be. And then there are firm-based views about countries gaining advantage, in that the best firms exist within with the best economies, and they make they are the agents of development, if you like, and that's pretty hard to justify, I think, from a macro perspective. The nation's competitive is based upon the ability of firms to innovate, you know, bringing up new and different ways of doing things. Well, I think I'm going to leave it. I'm going to keep my powder dry on that one, because we'll talk about that one in other sessions. But whichever perspective you adopt, or you believe, or that you accept, is that there is an axiom, and the axiom is that trade benefits. Trade is a good thing. And so what we have seen over time is that there are less and less trade barriers, unless you are I was going to say unless you are the current Conservative Party or the current UK government, but that's not strictly true, is it? Is that they might have walked away from a trading bloc, but the intention is to be able to reduce trading barriers across the rest of the trading world as well. In that the European Union has been perceived as being a trade barrier. You can make an argument, I think, for that as a case. It's not particularly one that I would subscribe to, but nevertheless is that trade barriers are being reduced globally. And of course is that this increases or the perspective of global trade is predicated upon increasing better transportation, which I think must mean cheaper, because it doesn't seem to make much sense to me that I should be able to buy my potatoes from Poland cheaper than I can buy potatoes that are actually made down or that are grown down the road. Because in East Yorkshire, where I live, there's an awful lot of, well, and maybe not East Yorkshire, but going further south then perhaps, let's go down into Lincolnshire, is that there's an awful lot of potatoes being grown. And it seems to me to be quite ludicrous that we can actually get them imported at a cheaper rate than we can get them made in our own country. And this must lead to all sorts of questions about the cost basis and the margins that are being deployed in these instances, but also the rate of government involvement in those particular markets. So, and that brings us on to globalization, because, you know, the idea of the globalized world is also predicated on a hyper trade, if you like. That's what the hyper globalist notion. And I just like this particular expression here, which is from Alain de Botton, and it's, you know, you can read this at your leisure, but broadly speaking is that a boat or a ship, a container ship, travels all over the world, picking up various goods and dropping them off in certain places. And, you know, the point being is that people who are assembling televisions in the Philippines or wherever it is, and I'll be able to enjoy my new TV whilst I'm sat in York later on tonight. And that's the kind of like the ideal of globalization. And it's rather simplistic, is it not? And, you know, we can challenge, we can either accept or we can challenge that. And as social scientists, is that perhaps what we need to do is we need to reflect upon the evidences that we've got at our disposal. And what you could say is that, you know, levels of wealth are increasing. Levels of wealth in certain parts of China are astronomical. You know, I teach on our global MBA before the global lockdown, is that I used to really enjoy going to Shanghai. And I would teach to Shanghai students who, to all intents and purposes, were dressed very much like me, were earning salaries that were commensurate with their Western counterparts, and were enjoying brands and so on and so forth that were Western. You know, things like Cartier and so on. And I'd go as far as to say Starbucks as well, is that, you know, within China, in the Chinese metropolitan areas, is that Starbucks is somewhat of a phenomenon, as is Nespresso. This is rather bizarre in a country that's got no cultural heritage about drinking coffee. But, you know, there was no cultural heritage about drinking coffee in our country until we started drinking coffee. So there's, but it's the way that those kind of like those trappings of wealth seem to look quite Western, quite westernized. And there, I don't know, but that maybe there is more of a resistance now, or there is a resurgence of its own culture, a resurgence of its own state of country. And in fact is that sometimes is that in this country you could be accused of being quite a terrible human being if you're overtly nationalistic or overtly patriotic to the English flag. The English flag is seen to be something which is rather fascistic in nature, but that doesn't apply to other countries like China and Japan and so on and so forth. And I just find that those discrepancies are quite odd. But nevertheless, is that, you know, the supporters of globalization would want to point to indicate to us a support for the notion of globalization is that global wealth is growing, and I think that that is incontrovertible. But this is downtown Detroit. Detroit was the manufacturing capital of cars of the world. Well, it sure ain't anymore. In the early 2000s, is that Detroit as a city, as a council, as a local government, was bankrupt. Where are the cars made now? The cars are made in Mexico, made in the Philippines. The cars, or there's American cars, are made in the Philippines and Mexico. Japanese cars are made all over the globe, and so on and so forth. But when this happens, when you get a displacement like this, is that it leaves behind elements of deprivation. In my own life experiences is that I used to live and was brought up in a mining area of Nottinghamshire, and the mines closed in the late 90s, well, mid to late 1980s, which had a detrimental impact upon the steel trade of Sheffield. And whilst Sheffield as a city may have recovered, the surrounding areas, the pit areas of Worksop, Nottingham, and the steel areas of Rotherham have perhaps not recovered to the extent that Sheffield has. And this is, this is several decades ago. So the point that I would make out is that the narrative, the sort of like the guiding narrative about trade and globalization as being creating global wealth is all well and good at a aggregate macro level, or maybe it's all well and good in certain circumstances, but there are contravening or contradictory evidences that we can draw upon, which, leads us to a more nuanced answer about, well, what's right? Because if you are experiencing globalization at a particular perspective, it has led to quite considerable protests. And these are some of the violent protests that have occurred at World Trade meetings, meetings of the G20. There were some particularly disruptive and quite violent protests, which resulted in quite extensive running, violence, displays of violence and aggression, I think would be more to the point, in Seattle in the 90s. So it's not this unidirectional thing that people would like to point towards. And of course, is that if what we're doing is that we are generating huge amounts of trade and transporting goods all over the world, from Djibouti to or let's say from Guadeloupe or South America, so that I can enjoy my avocado with my tuna fish, which has been caught, or hopefully on a line off somewhere in the Caribbean, is that has, as Beck has warned us, it does have considerable issues which we might describe as being externalities. Is that there are costs that are not being picked up by the governments or by the firms, but are having quite a detrimental impact upon our own economy. And this photograph of Earthshine, which was reportedly taken by one of the astronauts, by NASA, shows the vulnerability of the planet as against, if you like, the encroachment or the encroaching globalization of trade and the utilization of resources on our planet. This picture points out that the resources that we have are finite. You can see by looking at this particular image that it is finite. The globe in and of itself is finite. So globalization is a contested idea. We can stand back at awe and celebrate the promotion of technical sophistication, economic efficiency, and raising the world's living standards. But also it promotes in us fear and concern, protestation about job losses, the rise of sweatshops, criminal networks, terrorism, and pointless consumerism, leading to the depopulation of our own environment and the reduction on the very planet that we live upon. There is a huge tension between the two, which perhaps is not always adequately discussed or described when one advocates the notion of comparative advantage and the benefits of trade. So there is therefore one of the perspectives on globalization which I referred to earlier on, which is called the skeptic or skeptical perspective. And they would ask, where's the global in the globalization? We've seen all this before. In fact, the UK was probably more interlinked internationally during the times of empire than it ever has been during the age of globalization. And what they would argue, which is the bottom point there, is that they would argue that globalization then is a convenient myth that hides the neoliberal project. The neoliberal project would be the kind of capitalism that I described earlier on, market-based, allowing the guiding hand through the pricing mechanism to determine the most efficient way for countries and firms to operate, and that the place of the government, the state, let alone intra-government or intergovernmental agencies like the IMF and the World Bank, is that they have their only responsibility is to create peace, a legal framework, but allow the market and the firms within it, the agents within it, which tends to be people, to do what they do. And so the skeptics would say is that, you know, this creation of a globalization myth and the power of globalization just hides what's going on at a more grounded and real level. And should we be surprised by this, was a question that I have, is that this is from Marx. You'll recognize the old bearded wonder there on the right hand side, I'm sure, is that this is actually taken from Capital, and it's very telling as an expression. All fixed, fast frozen relationships with their train of agent, yada yada yada, established connections everywhere. Is that Marx in the mid 19th centuries was predicting global international trade and globalization in and of itself. So we should not therefore have been surprised about this, and questions might therefore be asked about, well, why have we not taken account of this? Do the skeptics have a point? Is that actually by just creating this globalization narrative or myth, is that it just allows people that have got the ability to control the means of production in order to be able to amass huge amounts of personal wealth to the detriment of others? And one of the things that the skeptics argue about is, where are the global firms? Well, I would argue that global firms are banks. Yes, there are some regional variations, but the powerful banks do have global outreach. The Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, HSBC, which is a London-based bank, but came out of Hong Kong, is absolutely huge, ginormous, as are other banking companies like Deutsche Bank and Goldman Sachs, amongst other American banks. And they can be seen to be global in their reach and in their activities. But of course, if we're looking at global firms, we ought to look as well at the tech firms that are part of this as well. And the tech firms, such as the Facebooks, the Amazons, and the Apples, less so, I think, probably Netflix, but I'm not quite sure actually, even the Googles, is that they are genuinely global, having a global reach now. Is that whilst you could say that Amazon has got competition from the Alibabas of this world, nevertheless, its data work, its CWS networks are global. Facebook is certainly global. Apple is certainly global. And Google was once restricted from trading in China, is now a partner of the Chinese government and could therefore also be seen to be global. And I'll come back to firms a bit more, because that really, the firm is the center of the debate, or center of the core of the argument for the transformationist argument. So we've got therefore a second perspective, which is the hyper-globalist perspective. And I think that the hyper-globalist is the kind of work that is dominant on both the left and the right. Okay, and this is the sort of perspective that really supports the wonderment of the globalization as being a staggering human achievement. Nation states are no longer significant. Clearly, nobody's told Mr. Trump this, or Mr. Johnson for that matter. Time and space. Time and space. What's the space, for goodness sake? Come on, sort your life out. Time and space is compressed. There's a death of distance, and as a consequence of that, as technology, is that we get unrestrained mobility of capital and technology flows, which leads towards this kind of the idea of best practice, a best practice economy. The local becomes transcended by the global, and consumer tastes and cultures become homogenized. Now, what do I mean by homogenized? Homogenized means the same. And I think that's interesting, is that there's a linkage there between best practice of economy and cultural tastes becoming homogenized too. And I'll come back to that in a little bit, but let's go on and talk about transformationist perspectives. Is that this perspective is very often presented as being an intermediate way between the skeptics on one hand and the hyperglobalists on the other. It's not, that's wrong, okay? It is a completely independent and discrete perspective, because here we are talking about issues of power. Who holds the power? And it's the big economies that hold the power, and they determine the rules of globalization. The agents of those economies, the big firms of those economies, the ones that I've just referred to earlier on, those banking firms and those tech firms are the ones that are driving the very notion of globalization. They are the ones that are pushing for the breaking down of international barriers. They are the ones that are stateless in many respects, in that Apple does have a formal headquarters at Cupertino Way, but is also based all over the globe. It has offices for different parts of its business all over the globe, from Ireland to Shanghai and so on and so forth. So debates about globalization ought to be about the question of power, organization and distribution. In that, when I was referring to, excuse me, mobile phones. When I was talking about the Chinese aspect and also about the distributions of wealth, is that it looks like the old industrial nations have done very well out of the globalization aspects of it, in that the firms in it themselves have done very well out of it. Is that we are not looking at international or global partners for even some of the Chinese businesses. Although, you know, whilst you may be aware that ICBC of China is the world's largest bank by the amount of assets that it holds, its geographical pool is quite considerably smaller than some of its American counterparts. So really we ought to look at the distribution of power, because those who have the power, we might argue that they've become very reluctant to share it and distribute it as well. And that leads to several other questions as well. Why is that? Why might that be? So globalization involves a shift or a transformation in scale of human social organization that extends the reach of power across the world, from the world's major regions and continents. Globalization produces winners and losers. The raising up of the Chinese middle class to the detriment of the car manufacturer in Detroit. And I'm not drawing a causal link there. I'm just drawing the possibilities between winners and losers. So you get winners and losers globally, nationally, and also, of course, very much so locally. Nation states no longer. Oh, where's that one come up again? We've done that one. Now let's talk more about culture, which is this part of this kind of homogenization. But culture also is very much related towards power. Is that it is the big nations, the big economies that seem to be exporting kinds of culture. Okay. Yes, I'm well aware that Bollywood exists in India, and I'm well aware that Hong Kong has got a very significant film industry, as does Nairobi, but it is dwarfed by the size of pre-COVID Hollywood anyway. So culture flows quite easily across the globe, but not all culture flows at the same rate. It's the culture of the powerful economies is a disproportionate power of flow. Is that anybody that's wearing a baseball hat the wrong way around would be asking, could perhaps look in the mirror as to say, well, where did this cultural meme come from? It's not typically UK based. It is something which is very street based and is very much US based. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just, that's what it is. Powerful media corporations, as a consequence of technological development and deregulation, shape the culture whilst determining what might actually be culture. And where you're talking about media corporations, I would include in that the big tech businesses as well. And the big tech businesses are not only producing their own media and are intermediaries or platforms for media is that they are moving huge amounts of data all over the globe and are having an impact upon the kind of like adverts that you are seeing. Is that those that can pick into those flows, those corporations that have the capacity to buy into flows of data and advertising flows, are shaping the kinds of culture of those that are receiving those adverts. Okay, so the power of a particular strong economy with those big tech businesses or those big media businesses, because of the nature of what they do, is that they are exporting cultural flows, which is leading towards a I don't want to use the word sameness, but there is a disproportionate impact in the recipient countries of the culture that is being exported. As an example, and I'm including the UK in this as well, because there are some very strong media corporations which utilize tech businesses in order to be able to export their products as well. So something like the Premier League or the English Premier League is a global phenomenon. I'm not a huge football fan, and it has always staggered me that people in Beijing want to watch Everton versus Sunderland on the television. When if you live in Sunderland or you live in Newcastle, you wouldn't want to watch that game anyway. But the idea that a lot of the teams that were very locally based or local people would be able to rise up and to play for these teams has gone, because of the fact that the sides that are representative of the English Football League contain players from all over the world. So not only does the product go out and shape the culture of the particular lands that it goes in, is that the product itself has been shaped as well, because it needs to be more representative of the global audience to which it reaches out to. Sport, I think, is a really interesting phenomenon in terms of global homogenization. And this is a game that I am interested in, cricket. And before coming and talking to you, I just had a quick glimpse at the IPL. The Indian Premier League, or the Indian cricket, 2020 cricket, and it's a phenomenon. It's a phenomenon in India, but look at the provenance of cricket as a game. Cricket as a game is an export from England, or from the UK, or England really, and that it's part and part of the imperialistic past of a lot of subcontinental India, in that expats from England needed people to play against, and so they created Indian cricket teams. And now Indian cricket teams have created a Premier League, not unlike the English Premier League, which is the zenith of what cricket is. As a product, it is a phenomenon in the way that, and again, it is having to represent the audiences to which it is exporting itself, in that you are seeing Australians, Kiwis, and so on and so forth imported into Indian franchises that play out in front of staggering crowds, or television crowds, at least this year, because no crowds are allowed in. But it's being played in Dubai, of all places, not actually in India. So it should be the Dubai Premier League, perhaps, but it isn't. But whichever way you look at it, it's an absolute phenomenon. So then I thought, well, can we look at globalization of culture, perhaps from something which is very, very localized? And this is a picture of Haramafuji. Haramafuji is, or was, yokozuna of Japanese sumo. He had to retire because of an incident that involved violence and beer, but he was forced to retire. But this is something which is probably the archetypal localized sport, what I've thought. Probably kabaddi as well might be another one that's similar to it. But that's not necessarily true, is it? Because actually the top ranks of sumo have got wrestlers now from Georgia, Bulgaria, Brazil. And here, this guy, Haramafuji, is Mongolian, and the Mongolians dominate contemporary. Well, at the moment, they're waning a little bit, but they do tend to dominate. And I wondered whether or not there was any further global encroachment of sumo into the world. And you didn't have to look too far before I found the Sumo World Championships. But more than that is that these were the Sumo World Championships for women. It was the Women's World Championships, and there exists a Men's World Championships as well. So even sumo, that sport that is so typical of Japan and so informed by its religions and its traditions and its histories, its culture, is encroaching upon outside of Japan. And this is a photograph of the World Championships. I think were actually this one was in Korea, I think, but America usually holds quite a lot of them. Yes, there is a Hungarian flag that's there. So just an example of how culture moves and flows. And here's another example. This is a photograph that I took when I was in Nepal. I was doing some work in Nepal, and this was a Nepalese street dancing competition. It wasn't particularly good, but he was. And you kind of, questions were all, I was sort of like bamboozled by these questions about how and why do Nepalese young people get so captured by the notion of American hip hop and street dancing, or Western dancing and American hip hop as it was, to the extent that actually you get derivations of hip hop or street music all over the globe now. I'm particularly quite fond of French hip hop because it seems to have quite a nice resonance and there's sort of like an ambient groove to it. I haven't a clue who it is. It's my son's the fan, and I don't mind dislike listening to it. But not far away from this was also a religious place, a temple, and then adjacent to the temple were lots of signs that were about Coca-Cola. And the way that the Coca-Cola things had been displayed is that it just struck me about which one was the example of religiosity within this particular context. But Nepalese street dancing. And music, of course, has always flowed across the globe, particularly now as, you know, recorded forms of music are not restricted to little discs or big discs or wherever it is that the music can flow all over the world because it's just zeros and ones. And that's leading to some interesting forms, new forms of culture, or mishmashes of culture, things that didn't ought to fit, sort of like American street music and reggae, or in this example, J-pop, Japanese pop music, and heavy metal. And you might look at this and say, well, this is just not very convincing at all, is it? But I've actually seen this lot live, and actually they're pretty good. And there's a track there's their first track that are released called Gimme Chocolate, which is a belting song, but actually when you listen to the lyrics, or you hear the lyrics, it's done in Japanese, you've got to go and translate. It's basically the concern of the young lady in the middle about eating chocolate and whether or not she's going to put any weight on, which is kind of odd sensibilities of taking the sensibilities of Japanese teenagers and young girls and smashing it into a world where it's based on double bass drums and big guitars and quick music. It's very odd, but nevertheless, it is a cultural phenomenon, and it's examples of these sort of like hybridizations of culture across the globe. Right, I've talked for about 45 minutes at this point, and I'm going to leave you for 10 minutes whilst I go and replenish my coffee cup and rest my voice for a little bit. We'll come back. What time is it now? Well, it's 5 minutes to the hour, so we'll come in at 10 minutes past the hour, and then I'll talk for maybe about another 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and then if you've got questions that you want to type in, we've got time that we can do that as well. So take a break now for 15 minutes, come back at 10 past the hour, and I'll carry on with this particular lecture. Okay, see you in a bit. Cultural convergence or hybridization, whichever way you want to look at it. I mean, the processes that are sometimes explained or theorized, there's a little bit of me that says, so what? Because the process, the end result's just the same, you know. So, and what we are witnessing, or what we see empirically, is that we see that there is this kind of like cultural similarities across the globe. Before I go on, can you can all see the screen and hear me? Can you? Somebody just nod just to tell me that you can. Yeah, thanks a lot. And I think, you know, a great example of a culture or of a business that is pretty much global would be the one of McDonald's. You know, is that there are lots of different derivations of McDonald's all over the globe. My personal favorite is the Singaporean nasi lemak burger. That one was pretty cool. Actually, it ran out very, very quickly as well when it was released on Singapore Day. But we've seen McDonald's across the globe, and this has led George Ritzer to suggest that what we're witnessing as a consequence of this widespread growth of McDonald's across the globe is indeed it's brought its own processes, which he's described as this is difficult to say, this is even for me, McDonaldization of business, but also I think of wider institutions within the social sphere. And McDonaldization is that you see attempts to try, or not more than attempts, I would argue, is that we're starting to see attempts and successful attempts, depending on how you determine the notion of success, to run different things alongside, based upon the principles of fast food restaurants. So what would we mean by that? As an example, we try and make things as efficient as we possibly can do, because therefore if they're efficient, we can calculate them exactly in terms of how something should relate to something else. There's a calculation that can be made. Predictability is that therefore is that we can, an efficient organization produces calculability, which produces predictable outcomes in terms of products, but also in terms of the way that people behave within a fast food restaurant, in that the job that's done is sort of set out in standard operating procedures, which is an extension of the world of Max Weber, an instrumental rationality. For those of you that might be interested, there's actually quite a good Wikipedia page on instrumental rationality. Normally you won't hear me advocating Wikipedia at all, because mostly it's rubbish. And if you're Chinese and you have Baidu, that's even worse, because that's usually a bad translated version of Wikipedia. But the pages on Weber and instrumental rationality are not bad. But the idea about is that we've become overtly rational, so that we try and predict and determine how the people will behave and how people will work. I'll come on to another example of that. Therefore, we use technology to displace people. And there's my illustration. What on earth are we doing now? Is that has higher education become a victim to McDonaldization? Is that its efficient utilization of time to calculate what we can get out of it? It's predictable in terms of its outcomes and the outcomes for the people that go through its portals, and we use technology in order to be able to displace people. Now, you could argue, well, this is all as a consequence of COVID, but what if COVID wasn't around? There's still a debate within higher education that we should commodify it, we should make it standardized, we should actually make it more easily accessible through technologies. Does that mean that we become more like a fast food restaurant? It's an open debate for you. And there's therefore is that what you end up with is a paradox of rationality, is that the business itself is rational, like a McDonald's restaurant, but let me tell you, there is nothing rational about joining long queues to get your food. Go through a drive-through on a Sunday morning for your McDonald's breakfast and queue up for 40 minutes in a car. That's not rational behaviour from anybody's sense. That's bloody stupid, that is, but nevertheless, we all do it. Well, we all do it. Maybe I'm drawing conclusions from my own behaviour, is that I do it because we like McDonald's. Anyway, so you get this paradox of rationality. That's the point that I'm making, okay, is that you get the efficiency here, but the inefficiency that sits outside it is that the efficiencies itself creates all sorts of bizarre behaviors on the outside of the world. And I think that the internet and social media produces some quite staggering behaviors outside of itself in order to demonstrate the irrationality and the paradox that can exist within efficient social medias and memes and so on and so forth. Just to say earlier on is that I talked about the impact of media corporations and the effect that they have on the world. And there's a very, very, very famous book written by a gentleman by the name of Noam Chomsky called Manufacturing Consent. That is available as a PDF, the downloadable PDF, if you were to want to search for it. But that is an incredible book, which is written in the 1980s, but predicts the rise of social media and big media corporations and the impact that those media corporations have across the globe. It's well worth checking out if you're interested in that sort of thing. Anyway, this idea about cultural homogenization or hybridization, but culture becoming similar across the globe, is that you might see slight variations, but sitting behind these variations are the same processes that are going on. And this is what Witzer calls the McDonaldization, to the extent where we can extend the metaphor of the fast food restaurant into other types of organization. And I've suggested maybe universities and higher education might be one that we could do that to as well. That is not the next slide. That is the next slide. So let's have a look at something a little bit more financially orientated. This is a slide that's from an Alliance report on global wealth distribution. And it's interesting. It's a pretty boring graph, but it's interesting in what it shows. And this is redolent of what we did in the tutorials, where we looked at a graph, and you can describe what the graph says. But then you need to actually think about the detail of the graph and can you interpret it to the next level? And that's what we're doing by being critical. And I can use this graph in order to actually show or to try and demonstrate the links between finance, economy, and culture, is because what we've got here on the left-hand side is that you've got 7 multicolored columns, okay? North America through to Asia, excluding Japan at the other end. And what they've done is that they've actually looked at the percentages of gross financial assets. So what percentages are held as which particular type of financial assets? And they're broken down. The key is at the bottom there, as you can see, is that we've got bank deposits, we've got securities, we've got insurances and pensions, and we've got other. You don't need to know what they are in terms of what the classification is, because we'll talk about those probably next week. I'll start to define those a little bit more clearly for you. But broadly speaking, bank deposits, you know what they are. It's money that you hold at the bank. Securities are basically shares or bonds, shares predominantly. Insurances and pensions, exactly what it is your pension scheme. And others would be other investments that perhaps people might be holding, which would be rather odd, I think, for households if they're holding things like personal derivatives and so on and so forth. Again, don't worry about the classifications. We'll talk about those. I think what's interesting is the way that these different assets are distributed in different areas. So let's have a look at North America as an example. North America has very little money or cash held in deposit, not much money in the bank. But the biggest element that it's got is securities, is stocks and shares. Now, the bulk of American wealth is held in stocks and shares. Americans trade in stocks and shares. Have you seen, as an example, Bloomberg television? Okay. Bloomberg television is a cultural artifact as a consequence of the fact that people trade in stocks and shares. Or does Bloomberg make people trade in stocks and shares, or does, because of the fact that people trade in stocks and shares, you get something like Bloomberg? But whatever you get is that you get Bloomberg TV, which looks like this. It's like television for people with attention deficit disorder. Is that normally the Bloomberg TV comprises of 2 people talking, or shouting at each other, usually at cross purposes and over the top of each other, whilst you get ticker tape things that disappear along the top and ticker tape that disappears across the bottom, and then you get all kinds of charts and text messages and all sorts of things that's going on the sides. And out of this melange of data and information, you're supposed to make coherent and rational decisions about stocks and shares and investments. It's remarkable. It's a real it's a real representation of some of the elements of American culture. Not all of American culture, but a lot of American culture is represented by something like Bloomberg TV. So there's an example there of the cultural impact of the economy. Okay, let's have a look at another one. Let's look at Western Europe. The bulk of investments or assets are in insurances and pensions in Western Europe. Western Europeans tend to be much more risk averse and see investment in large corporate entities and insurances or pension schemes. So it's very risk averse. The very slow growing kind of assets, but nevertheless is that there is an element that within our society of being risk averse, which means that we should invest in our pensions. And I think that's also about house prices and housing as well. And we'll come on to that on a different day. But now let's go across to Japan, which I think is another really interesting example, is that the Japanese are holding a huge amount of money that's in the bank. 55% of all of their assets are cash that's held in bank or deposits. I mean, it doesn't need to be cash, it could be deposits of all sorts of things. And you've got to, why is that? Why might that be? Well, if you look at the Japanese history, their recent history, or since, say recent, it's older than you lot, but I mean, let's go back to the early 1990s and the collapse of the Japanese property bubble in the early 1990s, is that an enormous part of the Japanese population had been investing in mortgages and in property and in land. And the asset prices of all of those things went up and up and up and up until the bubble collapsed. And many, many people in Japan were left holding assets that were now worthless. In other words, they lost a huge amount of money. They got burned badly. Just as they're recovering, 2008 and the global financial crisis comes along and the economy dives as well and people get made redundant. And as a consequence, the Japanese economy suffers recession as well. And then COVID comes along. I mean, these are actually before COVID, these figures are. I should imagine that it's likely to be worse in terms of the amount of cash that's being held at bank. So if that is your experiences, as you would be what? Born in the 1980s to experience the crash, the global financial crisis, and recessionary pressures and the activities of the bank. So you'd be older than you guys are. But nevertheless, is that you'd be in positions of seniority now. You'd be at the peak of your earning power. But if you have experienced two regional financial crises in your lifetime, which have been incredibly detrimental to the Japanese people, what would you want to do with your money? Because what do you need at the time of crisis? What do you need when you've not got your earning power has been reduced? You need what's referred to as, in the terminology, as liquidity. You need access to liquidity, cash in other words. So if your experiences are that economies can collapse and they can be very detrimental to your financial well-being, it's no surprise to me at all that the Japanese hold huge amounts of money in the bank because there's expectations that there's going to be another crisis around the corner. And they're just a financial crisis. Now look at the geography of Japan. Earthquakes, tsunamis, and tidal waves. You know, you need some cash in order to be able to tide you over, to see you through. So it's a cultural predisposition, a culture which has been born out of the histories of all of these countries, in order to which determines the kind of assets where people feel more comfortable to put their money. So as a consequence of this, it leads me to suggest that that whilst culture becomes homogenized across the planet for whatever reasons, is that what we can look at is the way that those cultures shape the way that people behave within businesses and within economies. And as a consequence of that, economy can be seen to have a cultural framing to it. The culture shapes the kind of capitalism or the kind of liberal market or the kind of controlled economies that we live in, that we think is acceptable and we think is normal. So, and I'll develop this notion about culture or cultural economy perspective as culture as a core to the way that we can see our economy, as differentiating it away from seeing economies as being built of markets which tend towards equilibrium. Okay, and when we start to look therefore at the arguments for two, or we look at the empirical evidence in favor of one or the other one, it allows us to draw conclusions. So as I said earlier, just in the last slide, is that we could start to see, because of the empirical evidence, not empirical evidence, that's my terrible pronunciation, apologies to all of you, is that you can start to see is that there is a cultural shaping to the economy and the way that economies work and behave, and also the way that we perceive them. Current modes of capitalism are shaped through circuits of capital, what Nigel Thrift calls circuits of capital. There's an article by Thrift that explains circuits of capital on the reading lists. In other words, it's the way that people think, act, speak, the way that we exist in the world. Circuits of capital are things like politicians, business leaders, university lecturers saying, oh yes, well, this is what you need to know, this is how it all works. And as a consequence of this, the way that we talk, the way that we think, the way that we act, is that actually we bring something into existence. Think about it. How do you describe, how do you know that you're, how could you determine reality, what your lived experience is? The only way that you can do it is by using language. The only way that I can tell you about my immediate environment is to use the words that come out of my mouth or to write it down. So this leads to the possibilities that words, language shape our very existence, because there's nothing else that can actually describe it. And in the process of describing it, you bring it about. Make it happen. If we all say something and we all believe it to be true, should we therefore be so surprised then it becomes true? It becomes real. Now, this is a huge leap, isn't it, away from knowing that there are objective facts and truths about the social world that we live in, into something which is completely composed of language. It's, in other words, it's subjective, it's interpretive. And if that's the nature of our society, then our understanding of an economy which tends towards laws needs to be thought about quite strongly. The view of the economy as a cultural system asserts that economy is comprised of a set of interrelated ideas and practices that are portrayed as being entirely natural. This is the natural way of things. In other words, the kinds of capitalism that we all see, that we all experience, that we all live in, is the natural way of doing things. This has become naturalized. But if it's actually being shaped by circuits of capital, by people that hold disproportionate amounts of power over everybody else, there's nothing natural about it. It's natural from somebody's perspective, not everybody's perspective. And looking at the cultural perspective provides us with alternative ideas, ways of thinking to the established view that capitalism is the optimum way of organizing our economy and society. How could we demonstrate that? Well, we would need to look at the evidence, wouldn't we? We would therefore need to think about how things work and then look at the evidence and then see whether or not we can interpret the evidence. It's an inductive form of logic. How can I understand? How can I demonstrate an understanding? And how does this work? And that is the critical task that we've kind of like set ourselves, I think, on this particular course. So there's a couple of examples of different readings for you. I'm going to leave you with this idea about the economy. And I think to make it easier, you've got to divorce yourself from what you understand as being economy in terms of economics. Okay, as I said in the online learning materials, what if there's more than one economy or more than one way of thinking about economy? That leads us into all sorts of debates about what we should be doing, how we should be doing it, how we should work and how we should live. It frees up opportunities. Instead of us having and being constrained by debates about capitalism and socialism and two sides and this and that and all the rest of it, we can have wider debates about trying to understand the implications of economics and business and what's it for, what does it do,